Welcome back to Power of the Mind, the podcast where we give you simple tools to improve your relationships with yourself and with others. This last week, we had a conversation about narcissism, and it got so interesting that we ended up having like a post conversation, which we recorded, and we thought it was so interesting that we would make another episode out of it. So this is the narcissism episode, part B.
So some of the coolest stuff happens. We get into a podcast and we're chatting about stuff, and then the cameras go off and we just get very candid with each other and we start talking. And that's when I think some of the best stuff happens. And maybe if Austin would get, maybe he should just leave the camera rolling for about half an hour after.
Idea.
One of the things I touched on is I have 5 children, 4 of them girls. And I think a narcissist or 2 has come into the fold a couple times. And one thing that this particular guy said to my daughter, and he told her, like a particular part of her body that he goes, most people wouldn't find this attractive, but I do.
Yeah,
this is okay.
Yeah, it's called negging. And it's there's a lot of research available now. Back in the day, you had to be particularly, narcissistic is probably the best way of putting it, but there are a lot of research. There's a lot of folks on YouTube who will talk a lot about pickup artists and what it means to psychologically more or less abuse a female into liking you and being attracted to you. And one of the best ways to do that is to present as, I think the word they use in that environment is as an alpha. So an alpha is a man who is strong, me strong. And there's a certain subset of the population, fairly large by my understanding of it, that find that very, very appealing. So negging is when I give a compliment and it's a backhanded compliment. So I walk up to somebody and say, "Oh, your nose looks a little less crooked when you do it. When you smile like that, it's cute." Okay, so that's not a particularly articulate or well done neg. But what I'm doing is I'm giving someone a compliment and doing it in a negative way. And it exploits, if a person has some insecurities, the little girl within will often seek out validation from that person. And we've seen this, you've seen this historically, the idea that people are attracted to the bad boys and the bad guys and something like that. So this is a way of creating that, casting yourself as a bad guy, so to speak, but a tough but vulnerable bad guy. And it can be very attractive to a lot of people. So, and it's really pathological. It's really, especially when it's done intentionally. Mm-hmm. It's really indicative of somebody who is sick. It's really sick.
And at this particular time, this guy was 15, 16 years old.
Yeah, he might have come by it. He might have come by it naturally. He might not have done the research and found out about it. But again, you're talking about somebody who just comes out of an environment where that is probably very normal and where power and control are the most important thing. What I can do to somebody, one thing that's really important, we were talking about narcissism earlier, and I mentioned that there was a large percentage of folks involved with narcissists. Large isn't the right word. There's a seemingly disproportionate number of people in relationship with narcissists who have what they call borderline personality disorder. And that's a really interesting combination, the borderline and the narcissist. They tend to play off one another relatively effectively, and sometimes that can be a very sticky relationship. But I want to say you can be relatively healthy and get pulled into a relationship with someone who has a narcissistic personality disorder fairly easily. They tend to be pretty charismatic, and if they're verbally advanced and have a relatively high IQ, they often come from a tremendous amount of trauma. And the more trauma a person has, I have found that they are more intuitive at knowing what I want to hear. That's been a survival tool they've used throughout their life. And so they can adjust themselves to become who I need them to be, kind of on the fly, often very, very effectively. Really gifted natural actors can do this too. And there's actually probably an overlap in those two groups. But So I can take, if somebody, one of the challenges I'll have with clients, I'll say, there's a real danger in being abnormally beautiful or abnormally rich or abnormally famous, because you will attract a certain subset of the population that you would not otherwise attract. Okay? If you're abnormally beautiful, a narcissistic person would like to have you around because you're going to make them look good. And they're entitled, and so of course they deserve somebody who is the top of the pile as far as beauty goes. If you're abnormally rich, same thing. If you're abnormally famous, same thing. You look at a lot of famous people, and once they become famous, they really struggle to make friends and make connections, and the reason is it's really hard to trust anybody. Everybody who runs into them is using them at some level because they, how good of friends could you really be with Brad Pitt? You hung out with Brad Pitt for an afternoon. She's like, I could figure it out. You hung out with Brad Pitt for an afternoon. The first thing, that shit would be on your Facebook feed
everywhere
in like 5 seconds. Mm-hmm. It's not about Brad.
It's about look at me.
No, look at me. And how could it? And that's, I'm sure, probably qualify. Anyway, when I've worked with folks who have been in those unique situations, they have to be very careful. And I actually will counsel parents at times, if you have a child who is abnormally attractive, you really have to prepare them. You have to prepare them to go out into the world. And because the world can be very, very hard for folks in that situation. And there can be a certain power to it as well. And there's a certain enjoyment of it. And that's great. But man, it's risky if you're not playing your cards right, particularly if you happen to be relatively agreeable. If you have an innate personality of agreeableness and wanting to be liked or wanting to please somebody else, somebody who's narcissistic, they're really good at exploiting sort of normal human behavior because they don't have the inconvenience of guilt, right?
Right.
So that makes them much more willing to do and say and behave in ways that the rest of us aren't to get what they want. And so that's the challenge that you're talking about there. So yeah, when someone's coming up and negging somebody else, especially the child within, especially if they have a certain amount of them that wants to be seen in a good light, and particularly if they're accustomed to being seen in a good light. Right. If I am used to being, I had a friend who made fun of Charles Barkley, actually. I'll even name the celebrity. He told me a story. He was at a show and Charles Barkley came up to him, and Charles Barkley's known for kind of hassling people a little bit, and he gave it right back to him. And he gave it back to him hard in ways that would make me uncomfortable. I couldn't have said it. Yeah. And they ran into each other every day for 3 or 4 days. And by the 5th day, Charles was like, man, I like you. I'm so tired of people blowing smoke up my ass all the time. I like you. And they sat down and developed kind of friendship. Now, this particular guy is really interesting because he couldn't give a crap if it was Charles Barkley or some other dude. Like, he doesn't have a particular interest in someone's fame. And I think that was probably part of it. But when you're particularly beautiful, particularly famous, or particularly rich, it's actually sort of a novelty to have someone treat you in a less than idealized way. And there's a part of us that's attracted to that strength and is also curious sometimes if we can beat it. If we can, let's see. I'm going to win you over, right? That's a normal response some of the time. And that it can be very dangerous in the wrong circumstances with the wrong person. And that's really the antidote to negging is don't fight it. You'll lose. Yeah, if you feel like you're chasing somebody. The other interesting thing is in relationships, if you're in a long-term relationship, Gottman did some studies on this, John Gottman and his wife. Really interesting studies. All of the Gottman stuff is really great. So much fun to learn about human behavior in the context of intimate relationships. If you have a 1 in 3, 1 in 2, 1 in 4, 1 to 5 ratio of positive to negative, right? If you have 1 negative for every 2, 3, or 4, the relationship probably won't work most of the time if both people are healthy. You have to have about a 1 to 5 or better. 5 nice things for every crappy thing. It's just about how we're wired. But what's interesting is obviously 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yeah, 1 to 10. Who wouldn't stay there?
Right.
1 to 11, you leave. If
It's too much.
it's not a challenge.
Yeah.
We need people. We are attracted to people who we can fight. We are attracted to people. There's some part of us that's attracted to people who won't put up with our shit. That's the reality. If a healthy relationship and a healthy marriage, people fight.
That I think about my relationship, obviously. It's like I would not. We were watching Modern Family the other day, and Frank's like, if I was that guy, like, could you? Because the husband's kind of goofball, and he just loves his, Claire, everything. He's like, could you be attracted to that? And I was like, I don't think so. Like, he's so nice, but give me a break.
Right.
I like the challenge.
We have to have a bit of a challenge. We have to have somebody to kind of go after us.
Keep you in check.
Yeah.
And
that is one of the human loopholes that someone with narcissistic personality disorder can exploit if they're willing to. And it's a really easy one to get caught up in. Doesn't require a bunch of trauma on your part to get sucked into this person's stuff. So I think we had some questions from the audience. What was your question?
My first question is about narcissism versus psychopathy or
Sociopathy or psychopathy, yeah.
Thank you. So you kind of mentioned it before as almost a sliding scale
into
being a sociopath from a narcissist, but what really defines the difference between them, and what is a narcissistic trait versus a sociopathic trait, and why can it be so dangerous?
Well, the biggest difference between really somebody who's sociopathic and somebody who's narcissistic, as I mentioned earlier, that a narcissist has that narcissist shame. And if they slow down and they stop for a minute, they really are aware that they don't like themselves and that they're lonely. Not always aware that they don't like themselves, but they're almost always aware that they're lonely. Okay? Somebody who's sociopathic is not. They're not lonely. They're fine. That's the principal difference between the two.
just no feeling at all.
No. Somebody who's sociopathic there really is no world outside of my world. You really are only an object. All right? That's a whole different zone there. They tend to be, most of the time, they're criminals, which is nice, because that's at least makes them identifiable. But you can get that in different situations. I've not run into very many. In the criminal element I've not run into very many functional sociopaths in my life. That I know of, anyway.
Yeah, how would you know?
They don't seek out therapy, that's for sure.
So it's essentially, at a very basic level, an extreme narcissist to the point that everything is them. There's nothing around them.
I think at the end of the day, I would probably need to defer to somebody who spent more time. Again, a lot of the people I work with have some criminal background, but I would have to defer to somebody who spent more time around folks who are truly sociopathic. But when you're talking about a sociopath, you're really talking about somebody who can very easily connect with the darker parts of themselves and has no real experience of human beings existing, basically. It's like life is a video game, right? There's no consequence to harming you because none of this is real. It doesn't. There's what makes me feel good, and that's all. And you're either that or you're not.
Oh.
It gets dark. It can be very dark.
Very quickly.
Yeah.
We always hear in diagnostics of murderers, right? Serial
Sure.
killers,
Yeah.
Sociopaths.
And I do think it's really interesting if you want to get into sort of the Jungian. Carl Jung was a contemporary of Sigmund Freud, and he talked about the shadow. And I can't remember who said absolute power, or power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. And you do find the shadow and the sociopath coming out in situations where there's absolute power a lot of the time. You get some of those really creatively awful Roman emperors, for example. Anybody who gets absolute power for a period of time, they tend to engage in some of the darker parts of the psyche. And that's, the sociopath just doesn't have the normal blocks to that part of themselves that the rest of us do. Even narcissists, again, there is still some shame. There is still an idea of an awareness of a lack of connection. Now, whether that can be overcome or not is a little bit different. And with enough work and willingness and, frankly, enough pain, narcissism can absolutely be overcome. But most people aren't willing to go through that much pain. Most of us aren't. I'm lazy. I've gone through some awful pain in my life, and I tend to avoid it. It's a pretty unique situation that would drive somebody. In order to get healthy, you have to want something more than what you have right now. There has to be something you're not willing to lose. There has to be something you really want, or you won't walk through the pain. I won't anyway. And so every time I've ever had periods of growth in my life, it's because I wanted something different than what I had. And I wanted it bad. But the work you have to do, the quantity of shame that someone who has a narcissistic personality disorder carries is enormous, indescribable. To be willing to walk through that, you have to be in a lot of pain. And most people don't get to that much pain. Most people choose death. And I see that with addiction, right? I'll see most of the narcissists I've met have been in the context of addiction. I've run into some in my private practice who haven't been addicted necessarily. And I've seen lots of them who they get off the drugs and the alcohol, and the shame comes, and they say, nah, I choose death. And more than a couple of them have died. What was the next question?
I'm not quite sure if this would be out of your realm, but you were talking about narcissism as it matures and you kind of slow down on your narcissistic traits, and then younger generations tend to be continuing more narcissistic traits, and narcissism may be something that we associate with more young men.
Oh,
You don't think
sure,
it's
maybe, yeah.
Is there a possibility that narcissism could be hormonal or a chemical imbalance of that sort?
Well, I don't know about that. Hormones, in my experience, and again, we are just a little outside my range, but hormones, I do think, I often talk about testosterone being its own pathology. And hormones can, in my experience, exacerbate what's there, right? They'll make my normal tendencies toward aggression stronger, or my normal tendency toward emotionalism perhaps a bit stronger. But the capacity to put myself in someone's shoes, theory of mind, carrying a massive quantity of shame, those are the hallmarks of narcissism. Hormones could make them a bit stronger, and perhaps the hormonal shift that men encounter in old age could contribute to the weakening of that stuff. There's a certain degree to which, as a person gets older and more aware of the fact that they're going to die, no matter what they do, and they have to sort of contend with that, that might be part of it too, whatever I'm trying to achieve. And then the other thing that happens in some of the clients that I've seen in my private practice is they just achieved everything. I'm going to be a millionaire. Everybody's going to know my name. I'm going to be somebody. And they get there and they're still miserable. I'm going to have all the women I want. Okay. Congratulations. You're a millionaire. Everybody knows your name in your industry, or sometimes in the world. You have all the women you want. Now what? Well, shit, my kids hate me. My ex-wife took half my stuff, which I don't mind. I didn't like her that much either, but I'm bummed about the kids a little bit. Now what? Okay, welcome to my office. Let's talk, right? Then we can go someplace there. So that might be part of it too, but there are people who are probably more qualified to dig into that than I am, experts on narcissism who've spent their career in it. I'm a dabbler in that regard. So I don't think I would go beyond what I have in terms of postulating why it might be different with age. It's a great question, though. Interesting theory. Maybe, but who knows?
I mean, we talked about nature versus nurture, but, for me, I'm noticing like the new generation, the participation trophies and the you're the best, Johnny, and nobody's prettier than you. And I mean, I do with my own granddaughter, she's perfect. She's 6 years old and she's perfect. And gosh, you just the most amazing. And I'm like, oh my gosh, am I creating a little future narcissist? But I think,
well, one thing I'd jump in there, right? That's a great point. And what I would suggest is we are creating narcissism and narcissistic behavior and narcissistic points of view, right? It's deeply narcissistic to think that the world should conform to what I want. But it's not narcissistic personality disorder. To have a narcissistic personality disorder, you have to really develop these traits of not being able to see not being able to put myself in other people's shoes, right? And my experience of that is generally that is related to trauma. Now, you can be not asked to put yourself in other people's shoes, but again, there's sort of an innate thing that happens in almost all developmental experience, as far as I can tell. So I just wanted to point that out. Like,
so it's okay. Okay.
You're okay indulging your granddaughter or whatever. It's a really interesting thing to see what happens to the culture as we become more and more affluent. Mm-hmm. I think I read, where did I read this? That burglary is at like an all-time low, maybe in history, right? And the reason is because everybody has tons of stuff in America, at least, right? Again, there are people who have less stuff, to be sure. Right. And how interesting. It's really interesting to see how as we become more affluent, and there's different levels, obviously, of affluence, but even the lower rungs have so much. Think about air conditioning, for example. The ability to control the environment in terms of, that's pretty new, relatively speaking. It's different. So many things. We could go pretty far down that trail, but as we become more that way, we take more and more for granted and tend to get more and more fussy, is my observation. The Romans did it. The Greeks did it. So be curious to see how we do it.
Getting fussy.
Definitely
fussy.
Getting a little entitled. Selfish is probably a better word than narcissistic.
Selfish. I think I see that. And, just kids today in our generation, not just kids, like us. Like, I don't want it to be above 68 degrees. Like 68 and oof.
Seriously.
Like these guys, like it's 72 in here.
Oh my gosh.
72?
Like the workhouse. Good Lord. Any other questions?
No, just personal anecdote.
Personal anecdote? Tell us.
Well, my roommate,
okay.
lovely man.
Yes.
Great friend, will always be. He is a self-described narcissist.
Oh, okay.
So he tells me all the time that he's a narcissist. And he has had more trauma than I could ever imagine in his life. More than anybody can probably ever imagine. But I'm curious to see if you think he's a narcissist versus just having narcissistic traits, because according to these, he does love admiration. He does have very superficial relationships. There's not a lot to them. They're very short. Nothing.
Yeah.
If someone gets too close, he
can't do it.
away. He just doesn't want them in his circle.
Mm-hmm.
But the people he does have in his circle, he keeps there forever.
Mm-hmm.
He does little comments like that. I would call them snide comments, where it's complimentary, but it's not. So then
sure.
and everything. He does that all the time. But I'm not sure where it goes is the lack of empathy and how I would gauge that and how I'd be able to kind of see if that's actually a possibility, or he just has narcissistic traits from a childhood of terrible, terrible trauma that he had to survive literally feeding himself.
Sure.
Versus...
Yeah, a lot of neglect. That's really common.
Yeah, exactly. Neglect. Yeah, tons of stuff there.
Yeah, I remember a client one time, I won't even tell the story in a public setting because we're recording it, but I can remember things of, just awful beatings, witnessing incredible domestic violence, hospitalization of his mother, and
plus more.
Yeah. Just all that.
Awful.
It's so interesting. One of the hallmarks of a personality disorder is an unwillingness to admit you have a personality disorder. I can think of a client I had where we talked about the characteristics. Like, for me personally, I go down the list here and I think, man, I'm going to make the cut on some of this stuff. I can be kind of envious. I can be entitled. I'm not always the most empathetic guy. If I'm ever in a situation with somebody and I say, well, let's go over this list of narcissistic traits. Score yourself, 1 to 7 or 8 or 9. I can't remember how many there are. And they say, none. Like, okay, we might be moving in the right direction here. So that's one characteristic to consider. if a person has enough insight to recognize their own narcissism, they may or may not qualify. I don't take self-diagnosis very far. Now, you can say that I'm going to behave. Basically, it can be a great way of dealing with the shame of who and how I see myself, right? I behave this way, and drug addicts will do this too. Nobody starts out as a drug addict, right? Well, once in a while they do, but generally speaking, they start out as somebody who's a recreational user, and then they want to stop and they try and they can't, and they try again and they can't, and they try again approximately 600 times, and then one day it dawns on them, well, trying to stop this sucks. I feel terrible about myself every time I try to stop. Why don't I just adopt the identity of drug addict? And then I won't have the pain of trying and failing. And so I say, I'm a drug addict. I'm not going to bother to quit until things get really, really bad. That sometimes I do. So there's a degree to which owning your pathology can make it a little more comfortable, right? If I'm really afraid everybody's going to discover that I'm a narcissist, and so I just tell them all,
Yep.
well, look, now people aren't going to leave me because of how selfish I am. In fact, it's sort of endearing to be around somebody who's open about their pathology, because all of us are selfish. You know, we all have a little narcissism in us.
It's not my fault, right? I'm a narcissist. It's just, this is who I am. I thought about that too when you were describing him. Is that an excuse almost? Like, well, I'm a narcissist, so it's just,
It's
just who I am.
Sure, of course. And it's also a statement of truth for that person, right? The reality is, I look at this list of characteristics that aren't particularly positive, and I see them in myself, and I recognize that I'm not ready to do the work to have a non-superficial or exploitive relationship. So, okay.
It's been fun up till now, right?
It's working. None of us will change until the pain of staying the same is greater than our fear of change, and really our fear of pain, because change hurts. So, cool. Good questions from the peanut gallery today. Anything else?
Behind the scenes was awesome.
Yeah.
No, that's it.
All right, great.
Next time we'll just learn to leave the camera rolling.
Yeah, it's probably better to do it that way.
Well, thank you guys for jumping back in with us. And as always, I'm Alicia Morgeau. This is Greg Struve, Power of the Mind with Granite Mountain Behavioral Healthcare. Thanks to Mary Lee for jumping in, our awesome media manager over there. And Austin, aka Batman, at the controls. Appreciate you guys. And we will see you next time.
Awesome. If you have a question or something you'd like us to discuss here on Power of the Mind, we would love to hear from you. Our email address is stories, STORIES, at signalsaz.com. That's stories, STORIES, at signals, SIGNALS, AZ.com. Look forward to hearing from you.